Recently, influencer Jemima Kirk had someone ask on her Instagram stories, "How do I stop feeling so insecure?" And she responded saying, "I think you guys think about yourselves too much." And her take hit. There was sort of a wave of people being like, this is literally it. If we just stopped thinking about ourselves so much, our insecurity would probably dry up. And according to the facts, that's true. This is actually something that I have been personally working on for the past year or two. I really realized that in my own life, the more I thought about myself, the worse I tended to feel. So I made it my personal mission to start thinking about myself less. I'm going to separate this podcast into three sections. Firstly, we're talking about why constantly thinking about yourself is going to make you unhappy and insecure. And then secondly, what makes some people think about themselves more than other people? And of course, we're making it actionable. How can you stop making yourself such a topic in your mind? Welcome to Grow With Intention, the podcast for people who want to create a life that feels good. We are diving into that first question. Why is it that people who think about themselves more tend to be more unhappy and more insecure? So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote the book Flow. And he kind of studied exactly this topic as it relates to achieving flow in your work. He has a lab in Chicago and he's had over 2,500 people walk around with little timer watches and little journals. The timer goes off at random times during the day, and when it goes off, the person who has it writes down their feelings, their mood, their self-esteem at that point in time. And this research showed that when people were thinking about themselves, their moods were lower. Their moods were negative. Thinking about yourself without intention actually has a name in the world of psychology, and that's self-focused rumination. How much you ruminate is one of the bigger predictors of your mental health. Another researcher found that self-focused rumination tends to occur more when people fail. So when you fail at achieving your goals, doing your daily habits, or in social interactions, your focus tends to shift from figuring out how to be successful to yourself. Thoughts about you, thoughts about how you feel, thoughts about why you feel the way you feel. And rumination actually takes up a lot of cognitive resources. So it's taken up a lot of energy in your brain, energy that you now cannot direct towards problem solving. So learned helplessness or the victim mindset, whatever you want to call it, can be maintained when you create this relationship with failure and self-focused rumination. Failure leads to thinking about yourself or self-focused rumination, which impairs your performance, which makes you more likely to fail, which leads to rumination. It's like a fun, horrible cycle. So why do some people have more self-focused rumination? Why do some people think about themselves more than other people? So people who ruminate a little bit more about themselves had a period in their life where their brain decided that rumination was helpful in some way, shape, or form, or it felt good. So maybe one day something bad happened, little rumination pathways in your brain lit up for the very first time, and the rumination pathways in your brain actually are linked to the problem-solving parts in your brain. So it kind of feels like you're doing something when you ruminate. It feels like it could be helpful. And your brain feels productive doing it. It gives your brain something to do when at times you might feel a little more helpless. That in itself is a reward. And if you know anything about the habit loop, it goes trigger, behavior, reward. So your brain feeling productive, that is a reward in the rumination loop. And that reward is what keeps rumination going. Maybe now you know, you are consciously aware that rumination sucks. It makes you feel bad. It's not doing any good for your life. But your brain still gets a bit of a reward out of it. There is definitely something in rumination that might feel appealing to a part of you. There are a few reasons that thinking about yourself or self-focused rumination might be a little bit more soft-wired in your brain, even though you know it's not helpful. Firstly, you may not know how much you ruminate. I know when I first started focusing on this as a form of self-work, I was not aware how much I ruminated. It was very rare that I would almost snap out of rumination and be like, oh damn, I was just ruminating. I would ruminate and not really realize I was doing it. And that's pretty common unless you've got some form of mindfulness in your life and you're actively trying to move past rumination. It's pretty easy to stay in that cycle without even noticing that you're doing it. You might also be someone that doesn't think you can do anything about your rumination, so you just keep on ruminating, which reinforces the rumination pathways in your brain. There may be some part of you that believes that rumination is actually helpful. A lot of people really feel like if they excessively worry about things, there's a benefit to that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It also is kind of oddly addicting to ruminate at times, especially if it's a kind of angry rumination. They've actually found that angry thinking can release dopamine in your brain, which is why it can feel quite addicting. That's why a lot of angry news stories can perform so well, because that anger rumination sets off a little bit of dopamine in your brain, which keeps you coming back for more. And angry rumination is still self-focused rumination because usually you're thinking about something, some bad event that happened to you. Also, the negativity bias is a very real thing. Negative thoughts can stick like Velcro, whereas happy thoughts tend to slip through our minds quite easily. And it makes sense from a biological perspective. So it's not that there is anything wrong with you, that self-focused rumination is a part of your life. Like thinking about yourself doesn't make you a shitty person. It's very common and it makes sense that you have self-focused rumination. And now moving on to the most important question of this podcast, which is, well, how do you actually stop thinking about yourself so much? Like, how can you break this habit so that you live a generally happier life? I want to talk about some of the things that I have been doing over the past year or two that have really helped me with this, starting with attention training. This is actually called the attention training technique, and it's part of metacognitive therapy, which is a lesser known form of therapy that's really helpful and more prominent, I think, in European countries. Could be wrong there. I remember when I was first dealing with this, for I think like 30 days straight, I did this attention training technique, which you can just look up and access for free online. There are also YouTube tracks that you can access. And what this training helps you to do is to practice the mental move of moving your attention. So the thing with this attention training is like all of the noises are always playing at the same volume, but you're just moving your attention from one noise to the other. And you'll find when you move your attention, for example, towards the sound of a train, the sound of the birds will just fade back into the distance. It's not that they disappear, but now that your attention is focused on the train noises, you're not thinking about the bird noises. They are there, you haven't gotten rid of them, but you're just not focusing on them. So the more that you do this attention training technique and the more that you build up your belief that it's possible for you to shift your attention from one thing to another, the more easy you will find it when self-focused thoughts come into your brain to shift from those self-focused thoughts to something else. And that could be something external, but it could also be different thoughts. This is not about suppressing your thoughts. This isn't about going like, nope, let's get rid of those thoughts. Let's stamp them out. It's literally just about moving where your attention is. You can also practice this with any form of like walking meditation, commute meditation. I have a mindful cleaning meditation on intention that's really good for this. It's just about practicing that mental move of shifting your attention and paying attention to the fact that you can shift your attention. It is totally possible for you to shift your focus. Idea number 2. So a lot of advice when it comes to therapy stuff is to change your thoughts, like change the content of your thoughts. For example, if you're thinking, I'm the worst, you want to change that to, I'm not so bad, everyone struggles. But if we're being real, a lot of our thoughts are only actually meaningful when we give them meaning. Like I often have really dumb thoughts, but I don't give them any personal meaning, so I can dismiss them with a lot of ease. It's only when we actually personally invest in our thoughts that they affect us. There's this quote from Michael Neal, and he says, a thought without personal investment is no more powerful than a tea bag without boiling water. Which is why idea number 2 for how to stop thinking about yourself so much is to forget about the content of your thoughts. And instead, when you're mid-thought, when you are mid-rumination, ask yourself, what am I getting out of this? How does it feel to do this? Is this helping me? Are these thoughts getting me somewhere? The more that you start to ask these questions, the more you'll realize, like mid-rumination, you'll be like, damn, these thoughts are not getting me anywhere. They are not helping me. And that's messing with the reward part of the habit loop. Like as soon as you can remove that reward, your brain will be less inclined to ruminate. Idea number 3. So much mental health content out there focuses on self-care, on acts of kindness towards yourself, on, yes, like the bubble bath and whatever, but also like doing nice things for yourself, going on walks, getting outside, all of which are important. But in one study, they actually compared other focused kindness to self-kindness. Other focused kindness won out because other focused kindness helps you to stop thinking so much about yourself. It improved well-being in a 6-week follow-up and also improved stress in a 6-month follow-up. In another study, acts of kindness actually won out over cognitive reappraisal, which is pretty much a lot of what therapy is, reappraising things. And it also won out over social activities for connection. So even though social activity is usually really good for anything like depression or anxiety, acts of kindness beat social connection. And most importantly, relevant to this podcast, the acts of kindness group actually showed a decrease in public self-absorption, which is self-focused rumination, thinking about themselves, compared to the other group. It seems like self-absorption doesn't really get improved by more socializing, but it can be improved by acts of kindness or focusing on other people. There are a few things that can make acts of kindness a little bit less effective. For example, I know that reactive kindness doesn't perform as well as proactive kindness. So if someone asks you, like, hey, I want help with this is not saying don't offer people help. Please don't take this that way. But it generally doesn't have as many benefits as you going out and being like, like, what do I want to do to help other people today? Also, variety is key. So it's one thing to help your friend tidy their house one week, but it's going to be a little bit different if you're doing that every single week. It may not have the same benefits. Once again, this isn't saying like, or drop anything that doesn't directly benefit you. But if you're, struggling, you're in a mental health space where you're like, I think about myself way too much, then focus a little bit more on proactive kindness if you can and vary it up. Like treat it like a fun, interesting practice. Ask yourself, how do I want to help people today? What's something fun and interesting that I could do that would help others? And the last idea is all about learning to reflect. So when I was in my early 20s, I tried journaling, and I've actually talked about this a lot on my channel. If you've watched my content for a long time, you would have seen my whole journey with journaling. I started out with this mindset of like, I'm going to try and journal. I'm going to change my life, like everyone online says. And then I actually journaled and I was like, oh, wow, like I'm just venting for 30 minutes and it's making me feel worse. What the heck is this? This is not what I expected. And now it's done like a full 180 and I'm like, journaling is changing my life. But the difference between how I first started journaling and how I journal now is that I use journaling to vent and I use journaling to almost like practice self-focused rumination, but on paper, which is obviously not helpful. There is a big difference between self-focused ruminative journaling and intentional reflective journaling. Here's one way that you can try to move from self-focused ruminative journaling to reflective journaling. Try journaling on a smaller problem that you're not so fixated on, that doesn't feel like so prominent in your life. Do a little journaling on that and try to come from a place of curiosity and objectivity. You're really acting like a curious scientist. That's the big difference between rumination and actual reflection. Once you can tell the difference between the feeling that comes alongside reflection and the feeling that comes alongside self-focused rumination, you will immediately be able to spot when you're in one or the other and know whether what you are doing is helpful. And when you can learn to reflect also, it becomes a lot easier to almost put off rumination. Like you might have a thought of, oh, my project is flopping. And you might go to ruminate on it. And then you might be like, actually, wait, I'm going to intentionally reflect on that later. So I'm going to not think about that or focus on that for now. And it'll feel a lot easier to do because you know that you have a very intentional reflection practice coming up. This is also a metacognitive therapy technique of like putting off thinking about your problems. Works really well for some people and not as well for other people, which is why it's important to explore and figure out what techniques work best for you when it comes to letting go of thinking about yourself. So let's talk about Recs of the week. Every week I give 2 recommendations for resources that will help you to dive deeper into the topics I mentioned in this episode. First recommendation, 500 Simple Acts of Kindness. This is like a random book off of Amazon. I don't recommend actually going through it and like ticking off one by one the activities recommended in the book, but it could get your brain thinking. Use it as a little like bouncing board. There's also a book by the same person or author, I'll have it linked in the show notes, that's called like Simple Acts of Love, because acts of kindness can totally be just directed at your partner. Like if you're trying to improve your relationship with your partner or a specific person in your life, you might just buy the Simple Acts of Love book and try to focus on acts of kindness towards just one individual. And my second rec is Metacognitive Therapy. I feel like I have recommended this book recently, but it's just a really good book and it inspired a lot of the stuff and the self-work in general on this particular topic. I wouldn't know much about self-focused rumination if it were not for metacognitive therapy. And there is a book called Metacognitive Therapy by Linda Sorensen that I highly recommend. Give it a read. It'll be in the show notes. And for our last segment, mini moves. I was sharing multiple mini moves, but I think I'm going to move to just like one mini move per podcast so it's not so overwhelming. Mini moves are little actionable steps that you can take to put what I have talked about into practice in your life so that you're not just listening and being like, yeah, good idea, but then not actually doing anything. So the mini move for this podcast episode is to brainstorm 5 reasonable, like doable acts of kindness. I would recommend thinking through the people that you love, the people that you are closest with, or just like people people in your community that you value and thinking of specific kind things that you could do for those people, I find that makes it a little bit more interesting. And also these general acts of kindness, like in the book that I recommended, sometimes they just don't feel very doable. But when you start thinking about actual people and names of people in your life and going, like what would make their life better? What would be a cute little thing that would make their day? That's when you start to get more creative ideas that just feel a little bit more doable. I appreciate you so much, and you'll hear from me soon.